Okay, I'm going to read one more section for you. And this is actually a chapter that I went backwards to write. I was probably about 2/3 of the way done writing cross country, and I started to feel like it was a much heavier story than I had planned. You mentioned the PTSD that Bets's father's dealing with. So the beginning of the book, we get her wrestling with that, and then she has this horrible person that she's sharing this trip with, and there's a lot of other things going on. She's dealing with different people's perspective on the war and people dealing with the civil rights movement at that time, and it just felt like this is a heavier story than I really planned, especially when the premise was that she's taking this cross-country trip to Woodstock. Like, that should be a kind of, hopefully, a fun adventure. So I started to think about, well, what can I add to this? Because I didn't want to take any of that away necessarily. I felt like that was an important part of what was happening. But I felt like, what can I add something in here to lighten this a little bit? And I thought about, well, what else is going on in 1969 that I can tie in? And thankfully, in July of 1969, we sent a couple guys to the moon. So I thought, well, that's perfect. Like, she would be certainly would be aware of that, and what could be more uplifting than sending some people into outer space to go to the moon. So that's how this chapter came to be. So I actually kind of went backwards and found a spot where it seemed to fit and worked this chapter in about Bets's experience with that. And just a couple things that I have in mind as far as writing historical fiction. It seems like there's kind of a range with historical fiction, and there's some historical fiction that is very heavy on the history, and very well researched, I'm sure, and you get done reading it and you feel like you really learned something about that person or that time period or that event, and that's great. And then kind of on the other side are my books, which are really much more focused on the story, and I really kind of think of my books as just, it's a story that happens to take place in the late 60s. So there's some historical tie-ins, but it's not, you don't feel like you're reading a history book when you get done. But when I do work on tying in history, I have a couple things in mind, because the reader has either experienced that themselves, and for that reader, I want to present it. I don't want it to just be a retelling. They have their own experience with it. I want to hopefully present that history in a new way. So I wanted to come up with something unique for telling this little bit of history. For someone who hasn't experienced that history firsthand, I want to make sure that I give that reader the significance of that history and make them see, why was this event important? Why was this event meaningful? It's not just important because it's in our history books. If you were there, if it happened to you, you would feel this, or you would think this. So those are some things that I had in mind when I wrote this chapter. So this is a point in the story. Seth is gone, thankfully. It's about halfway through, and they are camped outside of a town in their little VW, and Bets has gotten in the habit of going into, whenever they're near a town, she goes into town, and she mails postcards home, which was something I wanted her to do. I felt like the 16-year-old can't just leave her parents for months. Like she would do something to kind of keep that connection with her parents. So she's gone into this town and she's mailed her postcard, and then she realizes there's no one in this town. She's walking around and the streets are empty and she doesn't see any cars driving, but she hears noise, and she gets closer and she can make out voices, and she ends up going into this bar or restaurant, and it must be the only TV in town, because everyone in town, this little town, has gathered in this restaurant to watch the moon landing. And she immediately realizes that she's like, my gosh, I forgot about it. I almost missed it. And her next thought is that Emmy is back at their campsite and doesn't know about it, and she's missing it too. So she has this frantic trip back to their campsite to try to get her friend Emmy back to town so they can at least see some of the moon landing. My ride into town had been leisurely. I pedaled slowly, taking in the scenery and getting lost in my thoughts. My ride back was the opposite, furious and focused. I didn't stop to even consider why it was so important to me. It was important to everyone, it seemed. People had been talking about it for months, for years, I guess. It was important. I felt a pang and pushed aside the thought that what I really wanted, what I really should have been doing, was sitting at home between my parents, watching the moon landing with them. I got back as the last light was fading from the sky. Emmy was still off on the edge of the field we parked in. I called out to her in a voice that was too soft to get her attention. I called again, louder, not wanting to interrupt her, but desperately needing to tell her the news. Emmy stood and ran toward me. I remembered for one brief second the way she ran toward me in City Hall that day in San Francisco, but I pushed that memory away and brought myself back to the present. The moon, I shouted. We landed on the moon, we're gonna walk on it. Emmy had reached me in a whirl, her hair and dress flowing out behind her. She was as confused as I must have looked back in town, and I did my best to fill her in between gasps of breath. It's cool, Bets, she said in a calm voice. We'll tune in, it's cool. I tried to absorb some of Emmy's calm and make it my own, but it was impossible. Emmy opened the passenger side of the VW, and I followed close behind, expecting her to slide over to the driver's seat so I could hop in after her. Instead, she stopped with her feet still on the ground, and I nearly lost my balance, trying not to run right into the back of her. She leaned into the VW and turned on the radio. A blast of music came out the open door, but she quickly changed the station. There were bursts of static separated by snips of voice or music as Emmy turned the radio dial and scanned through the stations. She paused at a couple, listened for a second, and then moved on. Finally, she found it, and I heard the same static voices I'd heard on the TV in town. Emmy adjusted the dial, losing the station for a second, and then tuning it in perfectly so that the voices seemed like they were right there with us in the VW. Columbia, this is Houston. 1 minute and 30 seconds to LOS. All systems go, over. Columbia, thank you. Stay where you are a minute, Neil. Okay, need a little slack? You need more slack, Buzz? No, hold just a minute. Okay. I had no idea what they were talking about, but we were listening to voices from another world. I looked at Emmy, and she just looked back and smiled. We listened for another minute, neither of us saying anything, just looking at each other, then looking at nothing, the way people do when they're listening to something that they can't see while their minds are busy imagining it. We might be able to make it back to town in time, Bets, Emmy said with a smile, but watching from here is better. Her eyes shifted up toward the sky, and she giggled a little. My eyes followed hers, and then settled on the glowing white crescent hanging far above us, the moon. Then, without a word, Emmy turned toward the VW, stepped up onto the back tire, grabbed the roof rack, and pulled herself up onto the camper top. We hadn't raised the top of the camper when we parked, so she was able to crawl onto the large, flat roof and lie down. I wondered for a second if I'd be able to pull myself up to the roof with the same ease that Emmy had, but I didn't care. I repeated her steps onto the tire, grabbing the rack, and then I was beside her. The roof was uncomfortable at first, flat and hard, and I felt with my right hand for the edge, not wanting to fall off. But once I had settled myself and put my hands behind my head like a cushion, I felt my body relax and my eyes settled on the moon far above us. It was perfect. I felt foolish for thinking that we needed to rush into town to watch on TV. There was complete darkness around us, but only light came from the stars and the moon above us. The voices on the radio drifted out the open door and filled the night. I felt Emmy's hand brush mine and I reached out to hold it. My mind relaxed. I knew I couldn't possibly see the astronauts just by looking up at the moon in the sky, but I was overwhelmed by the sensation of hearing their voices on the radio while I was looking up at the new world they were exploring. Roger, we copy. It takes a pretty good jump. Okay, I'm at the foot of the ladder. I'm going to step off the limb now. There was a short silence on the radio, but we were still listening, knowing that the silence we were hearing was coming from far, far above us. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. And just like that, people from Earth had walked on the moon. Emmy and I lay there, listening to the voices on the radio and watching as the moon traced its path across the sky. It was a path that had followed every night since forever, but tonight it would be moving through the sky with 2 passengers on it. We listened long into the night. We heard the astronauts describe the surface of the moon, heard Houston call up questions and directions, heard the silence in between conversation when our imaginations took over. At some point, my thoughts drifted back to Earth and everything that had been on my mind for weeks, for months. Our trip across the country and Seth, the war, my father, somehow all of that seemed a little less important. How could it matter now? We walked on the moon. No, that wasn't right. It did matter. And it was just as important as it had been an hour ago or a month ago. The difference was that all those things were now happening in a world where people had figured out a way to send astronauts to the moon. If we could do that, if we could send people all the way to the moon, then anything was possible. Our trip across the country, that's easy. We've gone to the moon. Ending the war in Vietnam, of course, we've gone to the moon. My father, well, that was different. I pictured him at home, watching the moon landing on TV. Could he be thinking the same things that I was, feeling the same possibilities that the moon landing opened up for us? Was he realizing, right along with me, that we had landed on the moon and now anything was possible? I was hoping so.